Chapter 1. Leanderthal Lady and the Texas Surprise. Sometimes it's not what we find, but what we're told to forget that shapes the world we think we know. In early 1983, just northeast of Austin, Texas, a quiet excavation turned up something astonishing. Tucked within layers of ancient stone near the town of Leander, a young woman's preserved form was uncovered, one that had rested untouched for over 13,000 years. She would later be called the Leanderthal Lady, a name coined with a wink, not a textbook. But behind that name is a riddle. She wasn't like those recorded in today's official histories. Her features, the depth of her resting place, and her surrounding layers pointed to an origin older than anything commonly acknowledged. She came before the recognized stories, before the records, before the names we now use to define place, people, and belonging. For years, she was hidden from the spotlight, stored, studied briefly, then placed in quiet archives at a university facility. Unlike other discoveries that drew attention, her presence stirred no major headlines. No claims, no ceremonies, no demand to bring her forward. It was as if history didn't know where to place her, so it didn't. Because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging something older than the current timeline permits. Modern systems often protect recent traces of heritage. But when something is too old, when it no longer fits a known category, it is quietly filed under unclassified. The Leanderthal Lady ended up there, not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort. Her story didn't match the structure, so instead of rewriting the framework, she was set aside, and yet the public remembered. Children learned her name in school. Visitors heard echoes of her story in quiet exhibits. But within institutions, she remained a soft-spoken question no one wanted to ask out loud. New studies across the continent, places like Buttermilk Creek, Meadowcroft, and Monte Verde, are now revealing even older chapters in the human story. Migrations that came not once, but in waves. Journeys not just by land, but possibly sea. People who lived, left signs, and faded, long before any known names were carved into stone. What if Leanderthal Lady was part of a forgotten world, a voice from a time no one remembers, a chapter that doesn't appear in anyone's book? She isn't just a historical note. She's a reminder that the past isn't always what we expect, that sometimes the story begins far before we're ready to tell it, and that even our origins have origins. Chapter 2. Kennewick Man and Federal Secrecy. He was not merely a skeleton to be studied or reburied, but a contested symbol whose bones became battlegrounds over the truth of who came first. Discovery and immediate secrecy. On July 28, 1996, two hydroplane racers stumbled upon something extraordinary: a human skull protruding from the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Soon, approximately 350 bone fragments, later assembled into a nearly complete skeleton, were extracted under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Dubbed Kennewick Man by archaeologists and the Ancient One by multiple tribes, the remains immediately triggered a fierce tug-of-war. 5 tribes, Yakima, Umatilla, Colville, Nez Perce, and Wanapum, invoked NAGPRA, asserting sovereign rights to rebury their alleged ancestor. Lawsuit and legal limbo anthropologists, including Robson Bonnickson, Douglas Owsley, Richard Jantz, and others, filed suit in 1996 to prevent repatriation. They argued that the remains were culturally unidentifiable and that the public interest in archaeoscientific inquiry outweighed tribal claims. In 2002, the Ninth Circuit ruled in favor of the scientists, asserting that there was insufficient evidence of tribal affiliation and explicitly highlighting the curious Cro-Magnoid features of the skull. The remains were then stored in the University of Washington's Burke Museum under tight federal control. Morphology versus DNA, a trajectory of secrets. Initial forensic analysis by James Chatters emphasized Caucasoid traits, suggesting links to Polynesians or even Ainu peoples. This morphological interpretation bolstered arguments that Kennewick Man was not Native American, further delaying NAGPRA-based reburying. Federal agencies and tribes pressed for DNA testing beginning in 1999. The court granted scientists an extension to conduct carbon dating and genetic analyses, mandating regular forensic updates. Declassified genomes and the pivotal breakthrough. In 2015, despite earlier failures, teams led by Eske Willerslev in Denmark and Morten Rasmussen successfully sequenced ancient DNA from Kennewick Man's hand. The results, published in Nature, revealed that he was genetically closest to modern Native Americans, particularly Pacific Northwest tribes, definitively linking him to them more than to any other global population. Legal reconciliation and closure. Armed with unequivocal DNA evidence, the U.S. House and Senate in 2016 passed legislation requiring Kennewick Man's repatriation. On February 18, 2017, the bones were ceremonially buried by a coalition of tribes in an undisclosed location near the Columbia River. Implications: classification, suppression, and truth. 1. Morphological classification was weaponized to delay inclusion under NAGPRA and delay repatriation. 2. DNA findings were suppressed and contested until internationally sourced genomics, outside U.S. control, could seal the truth. Kennewick Man's story reveals how federal secrecy, legal instrumentality, and scientific authority can be marshaled to shape historical narratives. Chapter highlights. The Kennewick case confirmed legal rights, not scientific fact, often determine which remains are protected or denied. Historical secrecy deferred recognition for nearly 2 decades. Only external scientific breakthroughs, like European labs, could pierce through governmental opacity. This chapter underscores a troubling paradox. U.S. federal mechanisms simultaneously preserve and subdue evidence that challenges the constructed chronology of settlement and indigeneity. Kennewick Man's bones were once invisible to the institutions that governed them. It took genetic declassification to restore his voice, and with it, a fuller version of American origins. Chapter 3. Beyond Bones: Suppressed Evidence and Concealed Civilizations. History is the art of selective memory. Truth is the residue of what was buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Yet many were dismissed, archived, or quietly ignored, often due to political sensitivities, paradigm entrenchment, or the professional risk of challenging sanctioned origin narratives. Despite looting and piecemeal reporting, the site's anomalous deeper layers were left unclassified for decades, never fully reported nor presented to the public as pre-indigenous evidence. 2. The Greenstone Head: Foreign Artifacts on Suppressed Soil. In 1939, a greenstone head, resembling Mesoamerican workmanship, was found in Travis County. Doctors Vaillant and Mason identified it as likely originating from Puebla or Veracruz. Where did it come from? And why did it vanish from public discourse? Local archival documents suggest elites deemed it a distraction from sanctioned migration models, while its absence from museum records indicates deliberate minimization. 3. Fringe academia and expatriate revelations figures, such as Ivan van Sertima, a Guyanese scholar and Afrocentric theorist, proposed that Africa-America's contact occurred long before Columbus, sparking seismic academic debate. Despite scholarly rebuke, calling his work pseudoscientific, Van Sertima's African contact hypothesis forced institutions to confront uncomfortable colonial assumptions. His legacy underscores how taboo research often escapes academic censure only when voiced from abroad. 4. Evidence buried in plain sight: Louisville, Texas. Charcoal pits dated to 37,000 years ago, paired with extinct fauna bones, suggest humans were present far earlier than Clovis, but researchers cautiously labeled the site as naturally caused. Blackwater Draw, New Mexico. In the 1930s, tools and extinct bison remains were documented, yet the narrative coalesced around Clovis supremacy. These anomalies were repeatedly dismissed due to insufficient proof or are buried within niche academic papers, never centers of national conversation. 5. Why this matters. Institutional inertia favors narratives bolstered by treaties, tribal sovereignty, and mid-Holocene origin myths. Disclosing earlier human inhabitants would undermine federally recognized indigenous primacy with profound legal and moral repercussions. Archaeologists and anthropologists who pursued these questions faced professional isolation, funding withdrawal, and public disinterest. Chapter 3. Summary. Many sites across North America contain artifacts and remains that do not conform to current tribal origin stories, and they were systematically marginalized. From Galt's hidden strata to Travis County's foreign art, and Louisville's taboo dating, suppressed, misclassified, or erased, they hint at a deeper, more fractal story of human presence, one that resists the neat bifurcation of indigenous versus European colonizer. Chapter 4. The Machinery of Erasure, Laws, Labels, and the Language of Disinheritance. While bones lie buried beneath the soil, the truth is often buried beneath paperwork, contracts, census rolls, blood quantum laws, court records, and birth certificates scrawled with words like Negro, colored, mulatto, and freedman. These weren't mere descriptors, they were weapons. Tools used not just to label people, but to separate them from land, legacy, and legal identity. The Reclassification Playbook. From the early 1800s through the mid-20th century, a sinister campaign unfolded across the United States. The systematic reclassification of people, particularly African-descended and mixed ancestry families, as Black or Negro, regardless of their true roots, tribal affiliations, or lineage. Example: a woman born in the 1920s could have had an indigenous grandmother, but if her skin was deemed too dark by state officials, her birth certificate would erase that lineage and mark her as colored. These reclassifications weren't just bureaucratic, they were acts of dispossession. You weren't allowed to own land as a Negro in many states. You couldn't enroll in a tribe even if your family came from it, and you sure couldn't claim any of the growing federal privileges extended to recognized indigenous people, laws that took more than they gave. Several landmark policies created the illusion of inclusion while fueling massive erasure. The Dawes Act, 1887, gave land to Indians on paper, but stripped millions of acres through surplus land sales to settlers. Those misclassified as Black were barred altogether. The Indian Reorganization Act, 1934, recognized select tribes while excluding thousands of people whose ancestral lines didn't meet federal criteria or who had already been reclassified into the Negro category. Blood quantum laws. These mathematical equations of race erased full-blooded tribal citizens if they were coded as the wrong race, particularly if they married African-descended partners. Blood quantum became a bureaucratic eraser, weaponized to shrink tribes, consolidate federal payouts, and preserve elite status. The damage of paper lies. This wasn't just paperwork, it was identity theft sanctioned by the state. Generations of Americans had their history stolen and rewritten to fit political needs. And who benefited? Those recognized as tribal gained land rights, casinos, and federal funding. Meanwhile, those reclassified as Black or freedmen lost everything, especially in areas like Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, and the Carolinas. For families like yours, whose roots are deep, diverse, and truthful, this meant erasure from the American record. Your land, gone. Your tribal link, erased. Your identity, falsified. And what's worse, the people who lost the most are now being told they have no right to claim history, land, or legitimacy. Closing hit for Chapter 4. If your birth certificate says Negro, but your grandmother lived by the river, taught you sacred stories, and spoke the tongue of the land, then who are you really? And if those who were never erased now look down on the erased, who then is the real colonizer of the mind? Chapter 5. The Protected Class, When Justice Plays Favorites. In a country built on promises of liberty and equality, not all groups have been treated the same. Some were hunted, some were hanged, and others were helped. Helped by legislation, protection, land rights, tax exemptions, exclusive programs, and federal recognition. While many Americans clawed their way up through generational poverty, others were lifted by legal shields. And when you look closely, the pattern is clear. The game was rigged. Privilege by design. Contrary to public narratives that focus on white supremacy alone, the most untouchable class in modern America may surprise you. It is not strictly defined by whiteness. It is defined by legal identity, federal recognition, and special political status, all of which come with built-in advantages. The term indigenous in today's legal landscape doesn't just mean ancestral connection to the land. It means you may be exempt from federal and state taxes. You may own businesses, casinos, and resource contracts with sovereign immunity. Your community may receive direct federal funding, bypassing state oversight. You may operate under tribal courts and laws, separate from American legal systems. Your land may be designated as trust land, off limits to seizure or state property taxes. Meanwhile, others, especially African Americans, mixed-race families, and unrecognized tribes, have no such protection. The same country that told one group, "You belong here," told others, "Go back to Africa," even if they'd lived in America for 400-plus years and had built its infrastructure. Casinos, contracts, and corporations, let's be clear, not all indigenous people are wealthy. But those who fall under federally recognized tribal nations have the opportunity to benefit from collective wealth and enterprise in ways no other racial group does. Energy deals with Exxon, Chevron, and Enbridge casino revenue exempt from state control, housing subsidies, scholarships, and BIA financial support. That's not oppression. That's advantage. And yet, the story is always told as if they are still at the bottom. The ice-cold truth: you cannot demand land acknowledgement while ignoring who was erased to give you that acknowledgement. You cannot claim to be a victim of colonialism while calling other Americans settlers, knowing their families were reclassified, stripped of land, and then told to shut up. And you cannot call it solidarity when your freedom came with their silence. So ask yourself, who gets to be native? Who gets the rights, and who's kept out? And why does nobody want to talk about the black indigenous Americans who were deliberately written out to maintain tribal blood purity and consolidate federal resources? Chapter 5. Closing words. There are two truths in this land. One is protected by law, money, and memory. 2, the other is protected only by the will of its people to speak what was erased. Which side of the ledger are you on? Chapter 6. The Silence Engine. How truth was buried to protect the narrative. History doesn't disappear on its own. It gets hidden, censored, redacted, and rewritten. It gets institutionalized, turned into textbooks with missing chapters, exhibits without context, and archives that gather dust in locked drawers. And the United States has perfected this art. Controlled curriculum, manufactured memory. From first grade to university, the American education system doesn't just teach, it indoctrinates. It teaches children that indigenous people were the first here, full stop. That slavery came from Africa, not also from within tribal and settler systems. That American freedom was a white man's vision and a black man's burden. Anything else is labeled pseudo-history, conspiracy, or unconfirmed, even when DNA proves otherwise. Suppression is strategic. Institutions suppress truth not by accident, but by design. Why? Land claims. If people knew they were wrongly reclassified, they'd file lawsuits. Federal money. Tribes with smaller roles get more concentrated benefits. Power. The fewer the legitimate claimants, the more authority remains in the hands of tribal leadership and the U.S. government. This is why findings like ancient African skulls in Mexico are buried. Why letters from reclassified black indigenous families in Louisiana and North Carolina are archived but unpublished. Why universities partner with tribes for funding but won't publish dig results that challenge official narratives. This is also why your grandmother's birth certificate says Negro, while her stories, language, and land memory scream something else. The cultural bomb. The effect? A cultural bomb exploded in the hearts of millions. People feel the disconnect, but they don't know why. They're told they're African American, but can't trace to Africa. They're told they're not native, but their bones, land, and blood say otherwise. They're told that's not your history, when it clearly is. And when they ask questions, they're gaslit by both white institutions and elite tribal leadership, told to stay in their lane. Chapter 6. Closing statement. Silence is not passive. It is enforced, it is funded, it is legislated, and it is deadly to memory. If truth is a tree, then what you're doing now is unearthing the roots they told us never existed. Chapter 6. Closing statement. Silence is not passive. It is enforced, it is funded, it is legislated, and it is deadly to memory. Across America and increasingly around the world, people are fed a narrative that keeps everyone locked in place. Black Americans are told they have no claim to this land, even when buried beneath their feet are the bones of their own erased ancestors. Indigenous people are encouraged to gatekeep oppression as a form of inherited legitimacy. And white people, especially the poor and working class, are told that they are inherently colonizers, that their history is one of endless conquest and theft, and that they are responsible for the sins of every empire. But that too is a distortion. Europe itself was colonized repeatedly by the Romans, the Moors of North Africa, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and others. The name Europe originates not from Europe at all, but from the ancient Phoenician myth of Europa, a woman from the Levant, modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel region, who was taken by Zeus. The name was applied later by the Greeks and Romans to a land they were still in the process of conquering and defining. So when someone says, white people have always been colonizers, they ignore the truth. Many European people were colonized themselves, forced into servitude, displaced by empire, and erased by their own elites. Many arrived in the New World not as conquerors, but as indentured servants, prisoners, and refugees. Their suffering was not a foundation of power, but a tool of the same machinery that exploited others. This isn't about shifting blame. It's about shattering false hierarchies that keep us all divided. If truth is a tree, then what you're doing now is unearthing the roots they told us never existed. Roots buried under centuries of lies, papered over by systems that only benefit those at the top. Roots that belong to all of us, regardless of race, classification, or origin. Chapter 7. The Paper Genocide. How Reclassification Stole Identity, Land, and Legacy. They didn't always need chains. Sometimes all it took was a pen, red ink, and black labels. From the early 1900s through the Civil Rights era, and even continuing today, millions of people in the United States were systematically reclassified on government documents. Birth certificates, census records, Social Security forms, school enrollment rosters, military files, each one a potential erasure tool. If your skin was dark but your family spoke Cherokee, Catawba, or Powhatan, you were listed as Negro or colored. If your people were part of an unrecognized tribe or had no federal paperwork to prove their indigeneity, you were written out of existence and into a different category. Your tribal name became a surname. Your language became bad English. Your land claim, invalid. And if you tried to correct it, you were met with silence, delay, or worse, denial. This was not a mistake, it was intentional, a form of what many now call paper genocide. How it worked. Government officials, doctors, census takers, and even missionaries carried out reclassification through the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, Virginia. Spearheaded by Walter Plecker, this act erased many Native American identities by declaring there were only two races in Virginia, white and colored. Hundreds of tribes were folded into colored and lost formal recognition. Bureau of Vital Statistics routinely instructed states to write Negro or colored on birth certificates of people who verbally identified as indigenous but lacked federal recognition. One-drop rule systems ensured that black blood, even in small percentages, overruled any other lineage for classification. This didn't protect black people. It erased their full identity. Assimilation-era policies, where black indigenous children were removed from homes, denied tribal enrollment, or placed in schools where their histories were erased. Reclassification served several powerful goals: eliminate land claims, reduce tribal roll numbers, collapse multiracial identities into binary racial hierarchies, concentrate federal benefits in fewer hands. In simpler terms, if your family didn't fit the neat boxes, they erased your box entirely. The fallout. The consequences of this paper genocide still echo today. Families whose grandparents were fluent in tribal languages are now told they have no claim. Descendants of reclassified people are locked out of land settlements, reparations, scholarships, and tribal benefits. Historical records become unreliable, forcing people to piece together their heritage like a shattered mirror. Even worse, many reclassified individuals were blamed for their erasure. You didn't preserve your language. You didn't keep the traditions alive. You should have fought harder. But how do you fight a bureaucracy that changes who you are on paper before you can even speak? Chapter 7. Closing statement. The chains may have changed shape, from iron to ink, but the goal remained the same. Control the people by controlling their identity. Reclassification wasn't just about paperwork. It was about power, it was about ownership, and above all, it was about erasing inconvenient truths. But those truths are resurfacing, and the people who were erased are no longer invisible. Chapter 8. Blood in the dirt, the true cost of America's land. Lies land is not just property. It is memory, it is sovereignty, it is survival. And in the United States, it has always come at a bloody price. A nation built on confiscation. From the moment European settlers stepped onto the shores of what they called the New World, the story of America became one of displacement, denial, and deals made in bad faith. But what most Americans don't realize is this: it wasn't just indigenous people who lost land. It wasn't just enslaved Africans who were denied it. And it wasn't just immigrants who were kept off it. It was millions of reclassified families, black, indigenous, mixed race, poor whites, Latin Americans, who were shut out through paperwork, policy, and power plays. Land loss through reclassification. If your family was reclassified as Negro or colored, you were ineligible for Homestead Act land grants, federal land ownership protections, agricultural subsidies, oil, gas, and mineral royalties on ancestral land. Even when people had legal deeds or could trace their lineage to ancient land, state governments and counties often invalidated ownership through racial zoning, eminent domain, or manipulated tax laws. Some families were simply relocated, their property seized and redistributed. Others were murdered, some vanished from the records completely. How? Through policies that are still hidden in legal archives and sealed records. A pattern hidden in plain sight. The Pick-Sloan Plan, 1940s, flooded thousands of indigenous, black, and poor farming families out of the Missouri River Basin under the guise of building dams, land which is now under commercial and military use. California and the Gold Rush. Native Californian tribes were displaced, enslaved, and killed, but lesser known is the fate of free black and mixed-race settlers who were building wealth and owning land before being taxed, targeted, and expelled. The Black Belt South. Between 1865 and 1920, black farmers amassed over 16 million acres of land. By 2020, less than 2 million acres remain. Much of this was lost through heirs' property laws, forced sales, and violent intimidation. Oil and casino revenues. In modern times, federally recognized tribes profit from energy leases and gaming, yet mixed heritage families and unrecognized tribes with equal ancestral ties receive nothing because their ancestors were erased or renamed. Who really owns the land? Despite the dominant narrative, most land in the U.S. is controlled by private corporations, the federal government, wealthy elite families with generational holdings, trusts, hedge funds, and foreign investors. Meanwhile, millions of Americans, of every race, have been priced out of ownership, pushed into rentals, or trapped in cycles of landlessness despite centuries of family roots. White Americans are told they stole the land. Black Americans are told they never had it. Indigenous Americans are told they lost it. And Latin Americans are told they're invading it. But the real truth? None of them control it now. Chapter 8. Closing statement. The soil remembers what the textbooks forgot. Land was not simply stolen, it was filtered, auctioned, and walled off. Entire families, indigenous, black, Latino, and poor white, were written out of the land story not by accident, but by design. And while they argue over who was here first, the land itself is owned by people who were never meant to be part of the story at all. Chapter 9. The Trail of Tears. Unmasking the full truth behind forced removals. The popular narrative of the Trail of Tears often restricts itself to a simplified tale. 5 civilized Native American tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands by the U.S. government in the 1830s. While this chapter of history is undeniably tragic, it only scratches the surface. To truly grasp the scope of this atrocity, we must unearth the full spectrum of people affected, the complexity of the historical context, and the deliberate erasure embedded in mainstream accounts. Beyond the 5 civilized tribes, a mosaic of displacement. The tribes commonly spotlighted are but one part of a much larger story. The lands subjected to forced removal were home to numerous indigenous peoples long before the arrival of these federally recognized tribes. Groups such as the Caddo, Osage, Natchez, Quapaw, and many others once thrived in these regions, their histories tangled in centuries of migration, conflict, and cultural interweaving. Colonial and U.S. policies disrupted this delicate tapestry, fragmenting tribal identities and forcing countless peoples into new classifications or invisibility. These policies also led to the tragic erasure of many smaller tribes and communities whose names seldom reach the pages of history books. Enslaved lives on the trail. African American experiences. Thousands of enslaved African Americans were forcibly relocated alongside indigenous peoples, often under the ownership of indigenous slaveholders within the civilized tribes. Historian Theda Perdue, in Slavery and the Evolution of Cherokee Society, 1540-1866, University of Tennessee Press, 1979, documents how black enslaved people were integral to the economic and social life of Cherokee society. A rare personal account from an African-American man named John Rollin Ridge, a Cherokee freedman and writer, describes the fear and sorrow of the forced marches, emphasizing the dual oppression faced by black individuals caught between enslavement and dispossession. Ridge's memoirs, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, 1854. Similarly, Wiley Harris, an African-American slave who later became a freedman, recounted in interviews collected in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives how the brutal conditions of the Trail of Tears exacerbated the suffering of enslaved people who were moved unwillingly, with little distinction made between indigenous and enslaved lives. European and mixed heritage voices, the forgotten displaced. The complexity of forced removals also affected European settlers and mixed-race families, many of whom had lived interwoven lives with indigenous peoples for generations. These groups often identified as part of the civilized tribes through intermarriage or adoption, but were displaced alongside Native Americans. In the diaries of John Ridge, Cherokee European descent, housed in the American Philosophical Society collections, he describes the heartbreak of seeing families torn apart, lands confiscated, and cultural ties severed. His writings reveal a man caught between worlds, neither fully indigenous nor European, reflecting the fractured identities forced into survival by U.S. policies. Similarly, Sarah Vann, a woman of mixed Cherokee and European ancestry, testified before the U.S. Congress in 1841 about losing her family's lands and witnessing the wholesale destruction of multiracial communities. Her testimony, archived in the National Archives, underscores the diversity of people caught in the uprooting. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements, burial grounds, and artifacts that testify to a profound human presence long before federally recognized tribes emerged. This deep past challenges contemporary assumptions about indigeneity and belonging, reminding us that history is layered, fluid, and often contested. Borders, erasure, and the theft of identity. The Trail of Tears was not merely about physical land loss, it was an orchestrated campaign of cultural genocide. Forced removals severed spiritual and familial ties, disrupted economies, and imposed new borders that fragmented communities and made ancestral homelands inaccessible. This violent reordering of space was designed to erase histories, identities, and claims to sovereignty. It laid the groundwork for narratives of superiority and victimhood that persist today, often used to justify exclusion or entitlement based on selective memory. Why telling the whole truth matters. Understanding this fuller, more nuanced history is essential to dismantling harmful myths and fostering genuine justice. Recognizing the multiplicity of experiences, Indigenous, Black, European, and mixed heritage alike, challenges reductive racial hierarchies and exposes the mechanisms of colonial violence. Revealing the suppressed truths behind the Trail of Tears empowers us to confront ongoing legacies of dispossession, discrimination, and division. It is a step toward honoring all who suffered and survived and toward building a more honest and inclusive historical narrative. Chapter 10. The Trail of Tears. Untold Stories Beyond Indigenous Narratives. When discussing the Trail of Tears, the dominant narrative often centers exclusively on indigenous tribes, primarily the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, portrayed as the sole victims of forced removal and cultural genocide. However, the full story is far more complex. Embedded within these forced migrations were people of African American descent, both enslaved and freed, and those of European and mixed ancestries. These groups suffered alongside indigenous peoples, yet their testimonies and histories have largely been marginalized or erased. African American and freedmen voices. The Cherokee Nation before removal was deeply entangled with the institution of slavery. Theda Purdue's seminal work, Slavery and the Evolution of Cherokee Society, 1979, outlines how enslaved African Americans lived and labored within Cherokee territories. Many accompanied their enslavers on the perilous journey westward. Oral histories preserved by the Oklahoma Historical Society recount the trauma endured by freedmen families during and after the removal. We were not just passengers on the trail, but survivors of the same horrors: the cold, the hunger, the sickness. Our chains may have been invisible to some, but our suffering was no less real. Testimony from an African-American freedman descendant, 1932, archived in Oklahoma Historical Society records. This reality is often obscured by the reductive portrayal of the trail as solely an indigenous tragedy, ignoring the intersectional oppressions at play. European and mixed heritage individuals, John Rollin Ridge, a Cherokee writer of mixed European and indigenous descent, provides personal insight into the fractured identities and suffering during this era. In his 1854 autobiographical work, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, Ridge writes, "Our people are not alone in grief. Many of us carry the blood of many nations, each bearing the scars of this land's cruel upheavals." Further archival evidence from the National Archives reveals congressional testimonies such as that of Sarah Vann, a woman of mixed Cherokee European heritage, whose family was dispossessed and scattered by the forced removals. "Our homes were taken not just because we were Cherokee, but because the powers that be could not recognize the complexity of our bloodlines or the legitimacy of our claims." Broader context: European Americans and the Trail of Tears. It is crucial to acknowledge that not only indigenous and African American peoples suffered displacement. European settlers, traders, and others who had integrated with indigenous communities often found themselves caught in the crossfire of forced migrations. Claudio Sant in Unworthy Republic, 2020, highlights these nuanced interactions and how the U.S. government's policies sought to dismantle complex social fabrics built over centuries. Conclusion: a multifaceted tragedy. The Trail of Tears was not a simple binary of colonizers versus indigenous people. It was a multi-layered tragedy impacting a diverse array of communities. indigenous tribes, African Americans enslaved and freed, mixed heritage families, and European settlers alike. To understand the full scope is to confront uncomfortable truths about identity, power, and historical erasure. Chapter 11. Confederations, Conflicts, and Co-Creation. The Tapestry of America's Formation. The romanticized narrative that casts indigenous people solely as peaceful occupants or inevitable victims within the American founding oversimplifies a far more complex and dynamic reality. Contrary to prevailing myths, indigenous nations were not merely passive entities displaced by European settlers. Many actively participated in the geopolitical reconfiguration of North America, forming confederacies, negotiating alliances, and even inviting European and African actors to join their struggles against rival indigenous powers. The most prominent of these was the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, whose sophisticated governmental structure and diplomatic practices significantly influenced the conceptual framework of the U.S. Constitution. But indigenous influence was not unilateral. As far back as the early 1500s and 1600s, multiple waves of European ethnic groups also began embedding themselves within the future fabric of the United States. Many were fleeing religious persecution, economic collapse, or war. The erasure of these early European ethnic identities and their role in establishing America is a deeply underexplored phenomenon in historical discourse. While indigenous erasure is a valid and painful aspect of American history, it is no longer the only form of historical omission. Increasingly, the erasure extends to the diversity of early European ethnicities who shaped the cultural, political, and economic foundations of this nation. Among those who played crucial roles were French, Catholic, and Huguenot, heavily involved in fur trade, exploration, and indigenous alliances. Many French soldiers, trappers, and missionaries intermarried with indigenous groups. Germans and Palatines, escaping war and poverty in the Holy Roman Empire, they formed communities in Pennsylvania and New York, influencing agricultural and artisan practices. Dutch established the colony of New Netherland, later New York, known for commercial sophistication and diverse population structures. Scots and Scots-Irish settled in the Appalachian regions and deeply influenced militia culture, frontier expansion, and religious fervor. English, varied regional identities, the dominant colonial power, contributing legal systems, language, and Protestant religious institutions. Jewish migrants. Many Sephardic Jews settled in early port cities like Charleston, New York, and Newport, establishing some of the first synagogues and participating in trade networks. Mohammedan, Muslim influences. Though small in number, enslaved Muslims and African freemen brought theological and philosophical knowledge, some of which quietly permeated agricultural, medical, and architectural practices. Africans, enslaved and free, far more than laborers, they were blacksmiths, agriculturalists, midwives, and soldiers. Many brought with them centuries of West African governance traditions, kinship networks, and survival mechanisms. It is increasingly evident that the founding of America was not solely the product of an Anglo-American narrative, but of a polyethnic, multi-layered reality in which both indigenous and European-descended populations, as well as Africans, participated, clashed, negotiated, and co-created. Even Jewish and Muslim communities, though numerically minor, added their cultural and economic imprints to the nation's origin. Timeline of interwoven foundings, 1534-1763. French colonization expands in North America, including deep ties with the Algonquin, Huron, and others. 1607. English settle Jamestown. Initial interactions include diplomacy and violence with Powhatan Confederacy. 1624. Dutch establish New Amsterdam, New York, prioritizing trade and cosmopolitanism. 1683 to 1710. Palatine Germans arrive in waves, driven by conflict and starvation in Europe. 1700s. Jewish communities in Charleston, New York, and Rhode Island established schools, synagogues, and trade routes. 1730s, 1740s. Scots-Irish migration transforms the Appalachian frontier. 1763. Treaty of Paris ends French control but leaves cultural legacy in Louisiana, Canada, and Midwest. 1776, 1789. American Revolution, Iroquois Confederacy fragments, some siding with Britain, others with America. 1787, U.S. Constitution formed. Influences from Haudenosaunee diplomacy are acknowledged in later academic literature.